listening to Hotel Bar Sessions, the podcast where three philosophers sit down at the end of a long conference day to chop it up at the hotel bar, which, as we all know, is where the real philosophy happens. Welcome back, listeners, to another episode of Hotel Bar Sessions. My name is Leigh Johnson, and I am joined by my regular co-hosts, Bob Vallier and Jen Kling, and today we are talking about catastrophic philosophy. But before we get to that, as usual, we need to get some drink orders and put some tunes on the jukebox. So, Jen, what are you drinking and what song do you want today?
Good evening, Leigh. Today, I'm just going to have a gin and tonic. I'm feeling the need for something clear and clarifying. And my song for the jukebox is Panic at the Disco's I Write Sins, Not Tragedies.
I chime in with a haven't you people ever heard of closing a goddamn door? No, it's much better to face these kinds of things with a sense of poise and rationality. I chime in, haven't you people ever heard of closing a goddamn door? No, it's much better to face these kinds of things with
In the chorus, they sing, "It's much better to face these kinds of things with a sense of poise and rationality. So pour the champagne." And I kind of think that's how we should think about catastrophes, with a sense of poise and rationality, because what else are you going to do?
Pour the champagne.
Pour the champagne. Let's go.
Bob, what about you?
Well, in honor of the President of the United States, I would like to have a Moscow Mule. And for the song, I'm choosing REM's It's the End of the World as We Know It, which seems a bit of an obvious choice.
feeling pretty sight. It's the end of the world as we know it. It's the end of the world as we know it. It's the end of the world as we know it. And I feel fine.
You know, in that lyric there's lots of names and lots of events. Some of them really are catastrophes, others not. The refrain that we all know, it's the end of the world as we know it, and I feel fine. I don't know that I feel fine about it, but it is a kind of stoic lesson. You know, when we're faced with catastrophe, there are just some things that we can't do. There are some things that we can't help, and we just have to resign ourselves to that.
Leigh, how about you?
Well, tonight I'm just going to have a dirty vodka martini. And my song for the jukebox is an unusual one. I'm actually choosing Pop Goes the Weasel. So I don't know if they still have these. I kind of assume that they still do. But when I was a kid, there were these toys called Jack in the Boxes, where you would crank this handle on the side of the box while it played Pop Goes the Weasel. And at the end of the song, when the weasel pops, the box would open up and a clown would pop out. And it was always quite startling. But the song itself, if you've ever heard it, you know, it goes all around the mulberry bush. The monkey chased the weasel. The monkey stopped to pick up his sock, I think. Pop goes the weasel. And it has this kind of anticipatory, I don't know, dread to it all along. And then there's this moment where the catastrophe happens, where the weasel gets popped or the Jack in the Box pops out of the box. I think that really kind of describes how we experience catastrophes. That's probably why they use this tune so often in horror films, is that it kind of creeps and creeps and creeps, and then all of a sudden something happens. Now, maybe you have better relationships with clowns than I do, and it's not catastrophic when Jack popped out of the box, but it always was quite scary to me. So, Pop Goes the Weasel as my catastrophe song.
Everything you said to describe that song is highly sexual. Jack in the Box, cranking the handle, anticipatory dread.
Well,
Oh, man.
I don't even know what to say about that. Okay, so Bob, this was your topic, and so why don't you set up the conversation for us?
Well, all right. Happy to do so. You know, we use this word all the time, but we don't really know what it means. A catastrophe is literally from the Greek catastrophe, which is a downturn or a turn down. And it's also describing my dating life, incidentally. And originally, it has a mostly literary signification, that sort of unexpected plot twist of a drama, usually a tragedy. That moment when, for example, Oedipus finally gets it, allowing for the plot to move forward toward denouement and resolution. In tragedy, the implications of a catastrophic moment are life-altering, puts life in a fundamentally different perspective, and teaches us all something about the meaning of life. And hence, it's a moment that calls for philosophy. So it was appropriate to refer to the Sicilian expedition or the defeat of Athens by Sparta, or perhaps most fundamentally the execution of Socrates, as catastrophes, as downturns in the prominence of Athens and Athenian political life that called for Plato, ultimately. But the broader and more familiar sense of catastrophe as disaster or calamity or adversity caused by nature or by human activity didn't become current until 1742. And just over a decade later, a great catastrophe, the Lisbon earthquake, reshaped the entire European political landscape and led Voltaire to write Candide, a satirical critique of Leibniz's optimism. And Leibniz himself was responding and trying to make sense of a kind of catastrophe, namely the problem of evil. Now, notice in each case, and in so many others, the response to catastrophe is philosophy, or a philosophy. Platonic philosophy in response to the Athenian catastrophes, Stoicism in response to the destruction of Pompeii, Renaissance humanism in response to the devastation of the Black Plague, theodicy in response to the question of evil, Enlightenment philosophy in response to the failures of theodicy, existentialism in response to the horrors of World War I and the anxieties of modernity, a philosophy of human rights in response to World War II. And maybe we could say antinatalism is a response to climate change. The list could go on and on. So the questions I want to explore with you today over drinks are these. How have philosophers approached catastrophes? How should we face them? Stoically? Seeking consolation elsewhere? With existential authenticity? How are natural catastrophes compatible with the belief in a benign, all-powerful God? How ought we apportion responsibility and duty to tackle future human-made catastrophes such as climate change? How, in general, has philosophy responded to catastrophe, and what resources has it provided for thinking about the ethical and existential dimensions of catastrophe? Does it bring any consolation? Does it offer us anything new? Implicit in these questions are reflections on free will and determinism, personal ethics, the morality of good and evil. So, dear drinkers, pull up a stool. Let's engage in some catastrophic philosophizing. All right, welcome back. I hope you got a good drink and you're ready to enjoy this conversation. We're going to go in 3 parts as usual. In the first part, we'll talk about philosophy and catastrophe. In the second part, we'll talk about philosophy of catastrophe. And in the third part, we'll explore the possibilities of philosophy as catastrophe. So let's get started. Let's clarify some terms, first of all, because I used a whole bunch of them in the introduction. I used catastrophe, disaster, calamity, adversity. I could add some more like apocalypse, the sublime, and the event. These are all very related terms. They belong together in a family resemblance, but they don't all necessarily mean the same thing. So that's already worth exploring. But more broadly, the question here is philosophy always a response to catastrophe? And if so, what kind of response is it, and what does it teach us? Or is there a dialectical relation between catastrophe and philosophy? Is catastrophe what drives progress in philosophy?
You know, I didn't really know the etymology of the word until you just told us in the intro, but I do really love that catastrophe is literally a downturn. That seems to make it more closely linked to philosophy than I would have thought before this conversation. I think that when catastrophes happen, at least two questions often come to the fore. And one of them is what just happened, right? And philosophy is obviously helpful for us there in trying to figure out what the catastrophe was, how to understand the catastrophe, how to make it legible for us. But the other question I think that arises is, what can we believe now? Or what can we no longer believe that we could have believed before this catastrophe? And I think philosophy is helpful for that as well. So the catastrophe, the downturn, is a resetting of the world, right? Like the world becomes legible in a different kind of way after the catastrophe. And philosophy really is helpful in reading that new legibility.
The notion of a catastrophe as a downturn is interesting because it makes catastrophe not only a descriptive term, but also a moral term. One thing I thought of, Bob, when you were introducing us to the topic, is that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And so I was thinking, is it possible for one man's catastrophe to be another man's liberatory event? Because if that's the case, then catastrophe is always not only descriptive, but also prescriptive in a way that I think also makes it really helpful for philosophy.
Well, say something about how it's helpful as a prescriptive.
Maybe not that it's helpful to philosophy, but that it makes it even more subject to philosophical analysis. Because I think always when somebody describes something as a catastrophe, that's never a self-evident claim. It strikes me that you're always going to have to argue for that claim. Early American settler colonialists did not see the genocide of the Native Americans as a catastrophe. They saw it not as a downturn, but as an upturn. But Native Americans, quite rightly, saw it as catastrophic, as an ongoing catastrophe.
Before we get into these kinds of political questions, and politics can definitely be catastrophic, there's no question about it, it might be helpful to back up a little bit and remind ourselves that before there was philosophy, it was the purview of religion and theology broadly construed to make sense of catastrophes, precisely because catastrophes were almost always natural. Lightning striking, earthquakes, etc. These are the disgruntlements of the gods who are dissatisfied with human activity. And it's up to the priest to do something to mitigate that situation and to make sense of what we're experiencing as catastrophe. It's only later on, when catastrophes become something that humans create for themselves, perhaps through politics, that then it seems to me philosophy takes over as the meaning-making discourse in response to catastrophe.
In addition to religion, though, this was also the work of the arts as well to help us understand catastrophe. And of course, I'm thinking here specifically of tragedy. Catastrophe is the plot twist in tragedy, right? When Oedipus finally gets it, that getting it is philosophy. But the art of tragedy is what sort of lays out the catastrophe for us. Gives it the mise-en-scène in which it can become legible.
So when I think about catastrophes, I tend to think of two different kinds of catastrophes. And it strikes me that art and religion respond to different kinds of tragedies in very different ways. The two kinds of tragedies I'm thinking of are natural catastrophes and human-made catastrophes. Because it strikes me that the Lisbon earthquake is very, very different than the failures of theodicy in the Middle Ages. One strikes me as more of a catastrophe than the other.
I just want to put in one small objection here, which is that I don't think that there are such things as non-human catastrophes. I think naming something a catastrophe already makes it relative to human beings and human existence and human meaning. So that it might have been caused by humans or caused by nature is a different question. What caused the catastrophe is a different question than whether or not the catastrophe is a human catastrophe. I think just by calling it a catastrophe, it's human catastrophe.
It must be human. That's right, because, earthquakes happen all the time in very remote corners of the world where nobody lives. And because nobody lives there, nobody notices the earthquake.
And nobody calls it a catastrophe.
It can't be a catastrophe if it's not ruining your house.
Yeah, right.
Well, it might be a catastrophe for the animals that live there.
Well, we don't care about them.
Oh, I don't know that we have to make downturn relative to humans.
I wasn't saying that we have to make downturn relative to humans. I was saying that calling something a catastrophe is making meaning of an event. I don't think that animals make meaning of events in the same way that we do. To call something a catastrophe is inseparable from human meaning. So to say it's a catastrophe to the animals is already to make the animals human-like.
I don't think I agree with that. I think some things are what they are, regardless of whatever we call it. I say it is a catastrophe for the earthquake to happen to the animals in the remote corner of the world. When we call it a catastrophe, I agree, we're then doing something, we're placing an interpretation on the world. But it's also the case that the world is as it is, regardless of our interpretation.
Well, I don't know if I particularly like the "it is what it is" kind of argument in philosophy or in life. But let's not worry about the animals right now and whether or not they're experiencing catastrophe. Let's ask what we humans learn from catastrophes and what they teach us. I think, here's an assertion, that what all catastrophes, whether they be so-called natural or human-made catastrophes, so this includes the explosion of Pompeii, the response to which was the rise of Stoicism. That talks to us about what? It talks to us about our finitude.
Yeah.
The fact that life is short. I think that's a book by a Stoic. That life is short and we need to make the most of it because we could perish at any time and for no good reason. We could die a very ignominious death without consequence and without interest. And so while we're alive, we need to do something with our life in the best possible way. The same thing can be said of Renaissance humanism as a response to the Black Death. 3/4 of the European population died, right? And so the people who were left behind were like, hey, what's this all about, this crazy thing called life? And once they started asking that question, there was a flourishing of human creative activity. I think all catastrophes teach us about our finitude and how to manage it.
I really like this point. If I could just make one small alteration to it, though, I don't think that catastrophes themselves teach us anything. I think they disclose finitude. They kind of put it in our face. Because of that, we see the connection between catastrophe and philosophy. Because if the catastrophe is going to be educational, if it's going to teach us something, if we're going to learn something from it, we have to have philosophy or religion or art. But the catastrophe itself doesn't teach us about finitude. It just puts finitude right up in our face.
That's right. That's fair.
So this makes me wonder if catastrophe, to be a catastrophe or to be called a catastrophe, has to be of a certain scale. Because the Black Plague, clearly a catastrophe, clearly required some kind of philosophical response. But is every downturn in a person's life a catastrophe? That doesn't strike me as correct. It seems like there's some sort of scale going on here such that it has to disclose finitude in a certain kind of way.
That's why we have other words available to us. So we tend to overuse catastrophe, to hyperbolize it. But, we have these other words like disaster, which is literally a bad star. A disaster is a bad star. You're born under a bad star. You're just full of bad luck. Right? A calamity, adversity. Adversity is something coming at you etymologically, something coming at you and crossing you, blocking you. The sublime is a natural category that Kant develops out of his reading of the Lisbon earthquake, and it names those kinds of powerful events in human nature that are so overwhelming we can't wrap our heads around them. Right? That's not exactly a catastrophe, but it is a kind of epistemological and moral framework for thinking about our relationship to nature and to the power of nature.
So I'm trying to get clear on what constitutes a catastrophe. Because on the one hand, if a catastrophe is just anything that makes me think about my own finitude and my relationship to the world and nature, then lots of things can be catastrophes. But on the other hand, if a catastrophe has to have this sort of overwhelming effect, similar to Kant's sublime, then not very many things are going to count as catastrophes, even though we overuse the word.
I mean, again, sorry to sound like a broken record, but I think catastrophe is a human meaning-making term. It's a philosophical term. So to call something a catastrophe involves a certain kind of evaluation. It involves a certain kind of reflection. It involves a certain kind of reorienting oneself to the world after the catastrophe as opposed to the world before the catastrophe. So I'm really glad that Bob pointed out that we're going to divide this conversation into 3 sections. And right now we're talking about philosophy and catastrophe. And I'm saying that I don't think catastrophe can be separated from philosophy. I think philosophy can be separated from catastrophe, but I don't think that there is a catastrophic event that doesn't involve some kind of philosophical reflection. Now, maybe that philosophical reflection comes in the form of religion or comes in the form of art, which, by the way, I do kind of think are subfields of philosophy, but that's not a hill I want to die on right here. At any rate, it is about trying to read the world that has become either illegible or legible in a new way because of the catastrophe.
And I would add to that very quickly, it's also thinking about our own structures of knowing, our own rational structures, and how they may be inadequate for understanding what's going on and how they therefore need to be updated, improved, or completely retooled in order to be equal to the task of making sense of what has happened.
But if a catastrophe is something that makes us retool and rethink and reconfigure our philosophy of life, then lots of things, it seems to me, can count as catastrophes that I maybe don't want to count. So my favorite ice cream shop stops selling honeycomb ice cream, and they're never going to sell it again. And I go home and have an existential crisis, and this makes me learn how to make ice cream because I decide that I need to be more self-sufficient in my whole life. It's a silly example, but in a way it's caused me to rethink how I live my life. Is that a catastrophe? I might describe it for myself as a catastrophe for me.
You absolutely would not describe that as a catastrophe for you. Nobody would describe that as a catastrophe.
How dramatic am I being?
A little bit.
I think you're leaning into a hyperbole that is a little bit unbelievable. I don't think anybody would call that a catastrophe. And that's why we have other words for things that are unpleasant or inconvenient or other kinds of downturns. I don't think that anything could be a catastrophe. I don't think that philosophy is always a response to catastrophe either, nor is religion, nor is art. But I do think that when we call something catastrophic, that we're engaging in a kind of philosophy that is different than other kinds of philosophy that we do when we're dealing with other kinds of human events or human ideas or human lives, human worlds. I don't see the danger here that everything is a catastrophe. I think that if somebody called the fact that their ice cream shop stopped selling their favorite ice cream a catastrophe, I think we would all recognize that they're misusing the word catastrophe or they're being ironic.
I mean, we'd have a good laugh about it as well.
Yeah.
But, go back to the paradigm figure, Oedipus, right? His downturn, his catastrophe is when he finally gets it. And what happens in that moment? He knows what he has done. Knows that his whole life has been a struggle against a prophecy. And precisely for that very reason, the prophecy comes true. His entire framework of reference for his life is utterly destroyed in this moment. So that really truly is a catastrophe. If you can't get Superman ice cream anymore at the local ice cream parlor, well, that's sad, but your life will go on. The entire system of reference that defines your life has not come collapsing down. I mean, unless you are really fetishistically into whatever ice cream you like, but that would be not a catastrophe.
I mean, speak for yourself. Hey friends, Jen Kling here. If you like what we do at Hotel Bar Sessions and want to support the show, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Your support helps us keep our conversations going, literally. It covers the behind-the-scenes costs of producing the podcast and lets us carve out the time and space from our days to keep talking about the big ideas that matter. So if you're able, head over to our Patreon at patreon.com/hotelbarsessions. Sign up at any level and become part of the Hotel Bar Sessions community. If you'd prefer to make a one-time donation, or several one-time donations to our podcast, you can also do that through Venmo, Cash App, or PayPal via our website, hotelbarpodcast.com/support us. We appreciate every bit of support, and we're genuinely grateful that you're at the bar with us. Here's to more great conversations.
All right, so as Bob said at the top, we have split this into 3 sections. That first section was about philosophy and catastrophe, and now we're going to talk about philosophy of catastrophe. I want to go back to the questions that I said catastrophe raises for us, namely, first of all, what happened? Why did it happen? And also, how do we make sense of the world now in a way that we couldn't have before? And I think that Hannah Arendt is actually really useful here. Her move in The Origins of Totalitarianism was not really about hunting for the origin of totalitarianism, but clarifying the structure that made these catastrophes of totalitarianism possible. And I think that's a provocative thought, that catastrophe isn't just an event, it isn't just a rupture, it isn't just a downturn, but it's also a revelation of the fact that what was normal is not normal anymore. What was normal was quietly permitting certain kinds of horrors that we weren't able to see, but now we can.
The revelation, by the way, is apocalypse.
Right.
Which is another podcast.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
It's a whole other topic.
And just one more thing to be clear, Leigh, you said clarifying the structures. I would say just the structures of reason or of rationality. Because you can make the case that the Enlightenment project was probably a good thing overall, but it set in motion a number of themes, activities, and intellectual activities that ended up tending toward something that was not all that pleasant.
Yeah.
But it was baked into the project from the very beginning. So what Arendt is trying to do with totalitarianism is to show that, it's not a series of apparently disconnected events that constitute the origins of totalitarianism. It's the very nature of reason itself. And if we can sort of deconstruct that structure of reason, I know that's not her word, that's somebody else's, but if we can sort of deconstruct the structures of reasons to show how this developed, to show how it happened, then maybe we can do something to avoid it the next go around.
Yeah, and I think we can not exactly contrast, but at least compare that to Adorno. So when Adorno talks about after Auschwitz, he's claiming that time itself has been broken, that history just can't continue as if nothing happened. And we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to take that seriously, not just as a rhetorical question, but as a demand on how we live and how we think and how we teach. And I think we can see here 2 kind of jobs that philosophy can try to do after a catastrophe. On the one hand, we have the Arendtian model, which is about intelligibility. How could this happen? How did this happen? And then on the second hand, we have the Adorno model, which is about normativity. What must never happen again? How can we prevent this catastrophe from ever happening again?
In genocide studies, we have a macabre joke. I don't know what's worse, the fact that genocide happens or the fact that it happens often enough that we have a name for it. Because we don't just call it catastrophe, we call them genocides. And we have a name and we have a working definition because it happens with regrettable regularity.
Well, I think that everyone would call a genocide a catastrophe. I mean...
Oh, I agree. I'm not saying they're not. I was just meaning to say when we separate out between the Arendtian and the... I don't know how to make Adorno's name into a thing. Adornoian projects. I agree with you. Those are both philosophical projects. But in a way, it seems like they both always fail. Because I don't know that Arendt made it any more intelligible. And I don't think Adorno's project has succeeded because we've had genocide since the Holocaust, or Shoah as it's sometimes called.
But I don't think that either of those are indications of a failure. First of all, I do think that Arendt made totalitarianism more intelligible. So I think that she's succeeded in that. And I think that Adorno succeeded if what we take the normative force of his project to be to explain what must never happen again, which I think he did quite successfully. That we haven't followed that advice, that we haven't internalized that wisdom is not evidence of a philosophical failure. It's evidence of a human failure. So I think that these 2 jobs of philosophy make catastrophes intelligible. And then the other job, the normative job, explain how they must never happen again, or how we can live in a world or design a world or inhabit a world in which they never happen again. I think those two jobs have been quite successful in philosophy in the past. I mean, I'm just using these two people, Arendt and Adorno, but I mean, Heidegger talked a lot in a way about catastrophe. And
Heidegger, in a way, was a catastrophe, right? But go ahead and I'll interject.
Cosign.
Fair. But when Heidegger says everything is functioning, that's a diagnosis of the catastrophe of modernity. You know, his nightmare isn't an earthquake or a genocide or a single explosion. It's the world where everything is optimized.
Mm-hmm.
Right, this is just for reference from his essay, Question Concerning Technology, I believe.
Right.
And his concern about technology and how it inframes human being and renders them into exploitable material.
Right. And in that text, if we take Heidegger's point of view, we could see that catastrophes like Chernobyl, like 3 Mile Island, are just treated as acceptable costs. There's a moral logic hiding inside that technological logic or technical logic.
Or an amoral.
Yeah, so catastrophe isn't the exception. It's just the price tag of technology.
Although it's interesting that Heidegger himself, as I joked earlier, was a catastrophe. His personal catastrophe was joining the party. Don't be stupid, be like Marty. Come on, join the Nazi party.
Yeah.
And, you know, for everybody who reads Heidegger and agrees that he's a powerful thinker, this question is always, how was that possible that he could succumb to this kind of catastrophic politics? And to my knowledge, there's only two Heideggerians, and admittedly, my Heidegger scholarship is not what it used to be. But to my knowledge, there's only two Heideggerians who have attempted to do that kind of Arendtian analysis of how the thinker, on the basis of his own thinking, on the basis of the structures of rationality that govern his philosophy, could have debased himself in this way. Those two Heideggerians are Jacques Derrida in Of Spirit and a few other texts, and then David Farrell Crow in his work on Heidegger.
I don't know anything about Heidegger, so forgive me, but I think you're asking just such a really good question, because as you talked about his point about technology, in genocide studies, we often talk about genocide as a modern term.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons it's a modern term is because arguably genocides don't happen without new technology. The Holocaust was technologized.
Mm-hmm.
It was murder on an industrial scale, is the famous quote. And Heidegger's point that technology flattens human life is precisely what happened in the Holocaust. It couldn't have happened without technology. And so it's just amazing that somebody who would make that point would then join the Nazi party. I agree.
Well, he did the latter one first and then much later, the former one. But, you know, he did infamously make this remark. It's an unfortunate remark, but it's also an insightful one, that the Holocaust and genocide in general, but the Holocaust specifically, is not very different from industrialized farming.
Mm.
You know, one of the scariest lessons of genocide studies, I think, is that you don't need monsters. You don't need evil people.
Yeah.
You just need ordinary rationalities, technologies, incentives, obedient bureaucrats. That's what you need in order to have a human-made catastrophe on the level of something like genocide. Now, I say that because I think, in a way, that point kind of harmonizes Arendt's point and Heidegger's point without really flattening either one of them. But it's important for us to note that the philosophy of catastrophe is still either making catastrophe intelligible or the normative claim about how to prevent the catastrophe from reoccurring.
I think it's doing a little bit more than that. I think it's exposing what it is that's built into our particular conception of reason, Western conception of reason, that makes these kinds of moves possible. I think that's what a philosophy of catastrophe does best and is its most important contribution, arguably.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if there's a third vein here, because I agree entirely that a philosophy of catastrophe says, A, let's make this legible, B, how do we make it not happen again? I think there's a third element, which is, what is the appropriate response to the catastrophe that has just occurred? Naomi Zak talks about this in the context of disasters, but she also uses the language of catastrophe. not only do we have to think about stopping it from occurring, we have to think about how to respond. And she argues for an all-hands-on-deck response. She says, when catastrophes occur and we recognize them, we need to rush to aid immediately. An all-hands-on-deck response. So I'm wondering if there's a third element here when we're talking about philosophy of catastrophe.
Well, I think that would be a fourth element, but
Oh.
you lost track of the elements. I think that was the fourth element.
Oh, sorry.
Earth.
I think that's an interesting point that Zach makes, but I also think that it's hard for me to see how every response to a catastrophe is not part of the work of preventing the catastrophe from happening again. So I don't think that I would separate that from the normative philosophical work that I was describing before.
Let me give you an example that I think will help. When there were catastrophic fires in California about a year and a half ago, Donald Trump initially said, "I'm not sending any aid. California didn't vote for me." And a number of folks said, no, 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 no. Part of what it is to be part of the United States is to have an all-hands-on-deck response to the catastrophic fires in California. That's a philosophical response in that it's a moral response. It doesn't have anything to do with preventing future catastrophes.
Oh, I totally disagree. I think that you can see that in the counterexamples. So we could say, what does Donald Trump saying, "I'm not going to aid the victims of" do? It makes it possible for the catastrophe to happen again. When we do aid the victims of the catastrophe and treat it like a catastrophe, it makes it harder for the catastrophe to happen as a catastrophe again. You know, this all hands on deck, which is really important. And obviously, just as an immediate practical political point, important to say about how we ought to respond to catastrophes. But I don't think that it isn't still subsumed under the larger normative philosophical point that when we think about the philosophy of catastrophes, the normative point is, how do we prevent them from happening again? How do we build a world in which the catastrophe doesn't repeat?
Right. And I think all hands on deck is an important, urgent, immediate response. There's also a slow and deliberate response to catastrophes. So, for example, after World War II, we developed a philosophy of human rights, which was a vocabulary that didn't fully exist before. Yes, we had vocabulary about rights, but those were inalienable rights by which we were endowed by our creator. Not all of us. Only white property-holding men had those rights. But after World War II, this language, this vocabulary, this philosophy of human rights started to take shape, and it's an unfinished project. You know, it could still be more perfect, like the Union. But in any case, it's a slow and deliberate response that is being hammered out over decades in order to address contingencies that we could not foresee in 1945, hopefully to prevent similar things from happening again. Hey there, dear listeners. You know, everybody agrees that the best time of the conference is after the conference is over and we're all hanging out in the bar having discussions. It's our social hour. And speaking of being social, you should be following us on social media. You can find us on Blue Sky, YouTube, and Facebook. And in all three of those places, we're at Hotel Bar Sessions. So please follow us on social media and keep the social hour going.
We're now going to move into the third section of our discussion, which is philosophy as catastrophe. So I would say that all philosophers are beautiful catastrophes, but I don't think that's quite the idea that we're getting at. I think we're trying to get at the notion that philosophy can be a catastrophe in the sense of creating a rupture or forming a break in the world as it's gone these past ages. If that's right, then I think philosophy can be catastrophic, but maybe in a good way?
First, I want to say that I do think that there can be good catastrophes, I suppose you could say. I might want to describe it slightly differently. I think that we can have destructive catastrophes, which is the more conventional sense we mean when we say catastrophe. But I think we can also have liberating catastrophes that break the, oppression of common sense, or break the impression of, as Heidegger would say, what is said in the talk. what they say. That can be liberating. And I think there are plenty of philosophers who were catastrophic philosophers in that sense. And I don't think just philosophers. I mean, I think you could call somebody like Einstein a catastrophic physicist. I think you could call somebody like Picasso a catastrophic painter. We're talking about people who have made the old world illegible and demanded a new kind of legibility. If that's what catastrophe does, then I think that there are plenty of catastrophic philosophers and catastrophic philosophies.
Two of them in the 19th century are probably Marx, who disrupted our understanding of the world in some pretty important ways. I mean, he said philosophers have always interpreted the world, but the point is to do modal logic. No, he didn't say that. But is the Marxian analysis an example of catastrophic philosophy? I think probably so. And I think also the other great figure of the 19th century, Nietzsche, and his Death of God is a catastrophic pronouncement, at the very least, that altered the way we think about who we are. I mean, for me, the death of God means the death of metaphysics. And that then entails a new project, which is to understand what it means to be human in a radically non-metaphysical way, which is not terrifically easy. But in any case, I think those two are really two great examples of philosophy as catastrophe. They're from the 19th century, but what about the 20th century? I don't think analytic philosophy is particularly catastrophic.
Hey,
I
now.
may be wrong.
Yeah, I don't either.
Rude.
But what about the 20th century and even in the 21st centuries? Or has philosophy lost its edge?
I don't think that philosophy has lost its edge, and I'm going to hazard a candidate for the 20th century. I don't think we're far enough into the 21st century to say that there's been a catastrophic philosopher or a catastrophic philosophy of the 21st century. But I think that Derrida was a catastrophic philosopher of the 20th century with this stipulation, that catastrophe itself changed form. It wasn't a guillotine anymore. It was a system. And I think the structuralists and the post-structuralists, but Derrida in particular, showing us how we have to think philosophy in terms of systems of meaning, systems of language, systems of phonemes and graphemes and images and political values and moral values, etc., was a catastrophic turn in philosophy. And I mean that in the liberating, the positive sense.
Two things. First, I want catastrophic philosopher to go on my tombstone. So if analytic philosophers can't be catastrophic philosophers, I'm now very sad. But secondly, I want to push back against this idea that we can have a liberating catastrophe, because I want to hold on to the original notion of catastrophe from the first segment as a downturn. So I think this is why we have words like rupture. So I would describe Derrida as a liberatory philosopher, as a philosopher who created an important rupture. I'm not sure I would describe him as catastrophic, whereas I would describe maybe Nietzsche as catastrophic. That's because I have views about what Nietzsche's work did to philosophy. But I'm not sure we can say there's such a thing as a liberating philosophy. We could say there's a liberating rupture, but I wouldn't go so far as to say catastrophes can be good in that sense. I want to hold on to that notion of a downturn.
Well, okay, let me play with this idea for just a second, because I would say that Marx was a both liberating and catastrophic philosopher using catastrophe in the sense of downturn, not down in the sense of value, like lesser or worse, but down in the sense of literally turning things on their heads, showing us that our ideas are just in fact symptoms of material arrangements, flipping the causal arrow there. So in that sense, Marx is catastrophic in that etymological catastrophic sense. But because Marx is an example of that, I think that I would want to generalize that to say we can talk about catastrophic philosophers that really turn the world on its head, not necessarily in the exact same way that Marx did, but I think Nietzsche did that. I think Einstein did that. I think Picasso did that. And I think Derrida did that. So here I'm still using catastrophe in its literal sense, but I'm not taking down to mean bad.
Just on the basis of what you said about Marx, I'd be inclined to include in the 20th century pantheon of catastrophic philosophers Foucault.
Yeah.
In part because, like Derrida, he shows that human existence is governed by networks of power that manifest in all sorts of different ways, surprising ways. and goes to work on us, shaping us and our possibilities of understanding future actions in very particular ways. I feel I'm a little bit more philosophically close to Foucault than I am to Derrida. I love Derrida, but I'm a little bit skeptical that he might be a catastrophic philosopher. I see the argument that you're trying to make, and I don't disagree with it. I think Foucault, just because, he's more broadly accepted maybe in the humanities than Derrida is. There's always pushback against Derrida, right? Because he's too trendy, because he's too fashionable, whatever. I don't know. I don't understand that impulse. But in any case, I think Foucault's analytics of power have had more broad-based influence across the disciplines than Derrida's deconstruction has.
I think that's a fair criticism. And maybe it would be better for us, instead of talking about catastrophic philosophers, to talk about catastrophic philosophical ideas. And I think biopolitics would be one of those. This catastrophic idea that life itself is a site of governance. I think the Anthropocene is another catastrophic idea.
Yes.
Thinking about humanity as a geological force is another catastrophic idea. It totally reorients everything about how the world is legible. I think deconstruction is also a catastrophic idea. It tells us that meaning is unstable, our foundations are unstable. So I think all of these are catastrophic ideas and therefore catastrophic philosophies. And I suppose if we do it that way, if I go in through the back door, then I could call Derrida a catastrophic philosopher. I could call Foucault a catastrophic philosopher. And the ever-emerging philosophers of the Anthropocene, catastrophic philosophers.
So I do still want to push back against this notion that catastrophic philosophers or philosophies or ideas is just anything that turns the world on its head. I think that loses the core notion of catastrophe, which I would associate with something overwhelmingly bad that makes the world as it's been not intelligible, not only in a epistemological sense, but a moral sense. Adorno famously said, how can we do philosophy after the Holocaust? Millions upon millions of people are dead. And I think there's a difference between what's going on there and what we're doing in philosophy when we think of new ways to interpret and view the world. I'm not trying to claim that these weren't radical philosophers, that these weren't revolutionary philosophers, that these aren't world-flipping ideas. I'm not saying any of those things. But I think when we just start saying, look, everything that turns the world on its head counts as a catastrophe, we've lost the core notion.
Or inversely, you have a particular cognitive prejudice that catastrophe must necessarily be bad in order to qualify as catastrophe.
Yeah, that might be possible. But again, we're supposed to be taking care with the meanings of words. So as philosophers, one of the things we do is try to get clear about the concepts and terms that we're using. And if we're just going to say, well, catastrophe is just anything that turns the world on its head, I think we've lost the core concept that we're after.
I don't think anybody's saying
I
anything.
don't think that we've lost the core concept. I think you just disagree with it. So if I say that
that's
catastrophic things are things that destroy a world and create another world, and I say that's a catastrophic event, that's a catastrophic philosophy or catastrophic idea, and you disagree with that, that's fine. But that doesn't mean that I'm not being clear about what I mean by catastrophe.
And maybe it a little bit depends on what that new world that is created looks like.
Yeah, so one man's catastrophe is another man's liberation, right? We're right back to one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter.
Well, I think that some catastrophes can be liberatory, so I don't think those things have to be mutually exclusive.
So, right, and maybe that's the way we go. If that's the way we're going, then I would put Charles Mills on our list of 20th century thinkers who I would say are revolutionary, is what I would want to say instead of catastrophic. And I think those two words are different for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would also describe Charles Mills as revolutionary, and Charles Mills would describe Charles Mills as revolutionary.
He sure would.
Charles Mills absolutely grounded himself in the liberal tradition and revolutionized it. He didn't destroy the entire tradition. So, yeah, I think that I wouldn't call Charles Mills a catastrophic philosopher either, but that's, neither here nor there about whether there can, in fact, be catastrophic philosophers.
Just etymologically, revolutionary thought implies a revolution, the turning of a wheel.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And revolutions begin and end often at the same point, where nothing has really changed. Maybe things have changed a little bit or they've been elevated into a new sort of framework, but the same sort of structures of rationality are still in place. They may be in a different service, but they're still in place. In Catastrophe, I just said that very funny. Catastrophe is a smashing of the wheel, not just simply a rotation of the wheel.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes smashing the wheel is a really good thing. I sound like dialogue from Game of Thrones now, but
But then I don't know if we've had any catastrophic philosophy, because the philosophers you've all pointed to, they've provided us with what I would call revolutionary concepts, but they've not completely made it impossible to do philosophy in any other way. They've not smashed any wheels, so far as I can see.
right. So I'm agreeing that revolutionary and catastrophic are different.
Okay.
I still would say that some of the philosophers that we've mentioned were in fact catastrophic, that they destroyed the wheel. I mean, just to use Derrida, for example, because he's my boy, like Derrida destroyed the centrality of the metaphysics of presence. That is a huge destroying of the wheel.
But I think some people disagree that Derrida did that. Derrida thinks Derrida did that. You might think Derrida did that, but there are philosophers out there who disagree.
This comment about Charles Mill being a revolutionary philosopher is interesting. And, one thing about revolutions is that they are circles. They revolve. They turn like a wheel, right?
Mm-hmm.
And whenever you have a revolutionary idea, you inevitably have some sort of reactionary response to it, trying to preserve the wheel as is. So you can make the case that Charles Mills is a revolutionary philosopher. Lots of other people are revolutionary philosophers. They push ideas forward. They maybe change the nature of those ideas. But insofar as they're still caught up in this cycle of reaction and revolution, they're maintaining certain structures of rationality. Maybe what a catastrophic philosopher does is, for lack of a better word, deconstruct those cycles, those structures of rationality, and render them, as we've been saying, illegible or useless for continuing the project of philosophy forward.
That's a really helpful distinction, and I think helps me get clear on the difference that I was trying to push. Maybe another way to frame this is being either inside of a Hegelian dialectic or going completely outside of the dialectic altogether. And then we can have a discussion about which philosophers are within a dialectic and which philosophers are going entirely outside. Does that track?
That tracks a little bit for me, and that's another reason why I like this idea that maybe Anthropocene philosophy could be viewed as catastrophic as well. I have not read widely in this particular discourse, but it does strike me that they are trying to sort of say, look, the structures of human rationality up until now have resulted in very bad things, and we need to do something to put those to rest and develop new structures of understanding, new structures of rationality that respects the earth, respects our relationship to the earth, and moves us forward with a different form of thinking. They may be an example, perhaps Derrida is as well, of thinkers, philosophers who are outside of that dialectical system and really truly thinking catastrophically.
Well, a catastrophe has happened, and that is that our bartender has given us last call.
Oh, this is a downturn if ever there was one.
It's absolutely a downturn. So while we're getting our final drinks before we have to move on out of here, Bob, you want to wrap this up for us?
Well, partially. I want all of you to wrap it up as well. But, in this conversation, arguably, we have said that the relation between philosophy and catastrophe is perhaps dialectical in the narrow and generic sense, not Platonic, not Hegelian. And catastrophe is not necessarily understood as a singular, not necessarily negative event, but as an ongoing process. So perhaps because philosophy is always a product of its times and catastrophe is happening at all times, philosophy is necessarily and inherently catastrophic, or at least should be. But maybe each of us can catalog some important takeaway here, or as a last sip, add something that we didn't have time to discuss. Jen?
You came to me first and I'm still thinking. One thing I would like to say is, while I'm really interested in this connection between catastrophe and philosophy, I worry that it does what Ursula K. Le Guin worries about. I'm going to bring up my girl, Ursula K. Le Guin, again, where folks have this temptation to always focus on the big. And I think philosophy can actually do a lot of work and might be more helpfully turned towards the small, towards the everyday. I think it's right that there's a deep connection between philosophy and catastrophe, but I think when we focus on catastrophe, we sometimes avoid seeing some of the more everyday things that might be more helpful to focus on.
Well, focusing on the everyday is not a bad thing, and it is also the work of philosophy. Leigh, how about you?
Well, I think that one interesting possibility is that we might be able to say that every new philosophy paper that is generated by an LLM is catastrophic philosophy. And partially that's because it literally does destroy the wheel of how philosophy is done. It's an entirely new form of doing philosophy. Now, people might want to argue that it's not philosophy at all. That's an argument for another day. But inasmuch as all of us are getting papers turned in from students that are turning them in as philosophy papers, we might say that every single one of those papers are catastrophic philosophy.
Whoa, they're all catastrophes.
It might be a double meaning to what you're saying there. This paper is a catastrophe. Is written as a comment in red ink on a paper submitted by a student is going to generate a lot of parental phone calls.
Oh, Lord.
How dare you call my child's paper a catastrophe? But, I was in the back of my mind, especially when we were talking about Heidegger on technology, also thinking about AI and LLMs and the kind of impact that it's going to have on us. That impact has not yet been fully measured and probably won't be for several years, if not decades. But I think in the end, in the final analysis, when we're all old and decrepit, which I already am, then we'll look back on this particular conversation and say, aha, AI and LLMs definitely are catastrophic.
To the catastrophe.
What a good name for a bar.
Viva la catastrophe.
Viva la catastrophe. Right.
Viva la catastrophe. Oh, man.
All right, I'll catch you guys next time.
All right.
Bye, friends.
Happy drinking.